She did not want to be there. That much was obvious to anyone paying attention, and she had spent enough years being overlooked to understand how little attention she was likely to receive. She sat near the back of the attorney's conference room, with her hands folded in her lap, her coat still on despite the warmth of the room, as though she intended to leave quickly and without ceremony. Around her, her brothers occupied the space, the way men who feel entitled to rooms always do, leaning back, shifting their weight, claiming the air through volume and assumption. The attorney read from the document in front of him, with the careful neutrality of someone who had witnessed enough family rooms fill with disappointment to have stopped expecting otherwise. He spoke of assets, of accounts, of property holdings that had appreciated quietly over decades, while their grandfather lived in the same modest house at the end of a gravel road outside of town, driving the same truck, wearing the same boots, buying coffee from the same gas station every morning without variation or complaint. Their grandfather had not been a man who discussed money. He had been a man who accumulated silence the way others accumulated debt, carefully and without spectacle, as though silence were a form of investment that paid better than most. The brothers had arrived with expectations. She could see it in the way the older one tapped his finger against the table, not from nerves, but from impatience. The tapping of a man who believes the answer is taking too long to reach him. The younger one sat differently, his expression flatter, and his gaze fixed on the document as if memorizing it might change its contents. Both of them had driven in that morning from different cities. Both of them had called ahead to confirm the time. Neither of them had called her. She had found out about the reading through her mother, who had found out through the attorney's office, which had sent letters to all 3 of the grandchildren by certified mail. Her letter had arrived 2 days after her brother's. Whether that was a clerical error or something else, she had never been able to determine, and she had eventually stopped trying. The attorney reached the section concerning liquid assets. The number he read was substantial, not extraordinary by the standards of people who moved in rooms where such numbers were commonplace, but for a family that had grown up understanding money primarily as the space between what was needed and what was available, it landed with weight. The older brother exhaled slowly through his nose. The younger one looked at the ceiling and then back down again. The estate had been divided deliberately, not equally. Their grandfather had been specific in his instructions, and the attorney said so plainly, without softening the phrasing. The accounts, the property, the accumulated holdings would pass primarily to the 2 grandsons. The language of the document, when the attorney read it aloud, was precise and final in the way that only documents written by men who know they will not be present for the arguments afterward can be. There was a pause after the attorney finished that section, a pause dense with the kind of recalculation that people do when they realize what they believed was certain has shifted. The older brother spoke first, asking about timelines, about transfer procedures, about access. The younger brother asked about real property. Neither of them looked at her. Then the attorney said her name. She did not lean forward. She remained exactly as she had been, her hands still folded, her coat still on. The attorney explained that their grandfather had set aside one item specifically for her, described in the document with the same deliberateness that governed the rest. Not an account, not a property, an object, a footlocker. The older brother made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The younger brother's expression did not change, but the stillness in it deepened slightly, the way still water deepens when something passes beneath it. Neither of them said anything directly. They did not need to. The geometry of the moment said it for them. They had received the substance of an estate built over 60 years of quiet accumulation. She had received a box. The attorney provided the dimensions and location of the item in the same tone he had used to describe the assets, which was either professional courtesy or a genuine indifference to the difference between them. The Footlocker was currently stored in the detached workshop at the grandfather's residence, the attorney said. The keys to the workshop were included in a sealed envelope addressed to her, which he slid across the table without ceremony. She picked up the envelope and placed it inside her coat pocket without opening it. On the drive home, the older brother called her. She let it go to voicemail. When she listened to the message later that night, standing in the kitchen of her apartment with the lights still off, he spoke in the tone he had always used when explaining things he believed she had failed to understand. He said that the Footlocker was likely just old paperwork, maybe some tools, maybe nothing worth the drive. He said he hoped she was not reading too much into the bequest. He said their grandfather had been sentimental in his later years, and that sentiment was not the same as intention. He said to call him when she got a chance. She did not call him back. She had lived in the apartment for 4 years, which was the longest she had lived anywhere since leaving her grandfather's town at 19. The apartment was on the second floor of a building that had once been a textile warehouse, and it retained the original proportions of industrial space in a way that made her small collection of furniture look provisional regardless of how she arranged it. She worked as a records coordinator for a county health department, a position that required precision and consistency and rewarded neither particularly, but which provided the kind of stability she had decided to value over the kind of ambition she had once carried and eventually set down. She was 34 years old. She was not unhappy. She had learned the distinction between unhappiness and the absence of certain things, and she had made her peace with the absence in the manner of someone who understands that peace is not the same as indifference, but accepts it as the best available alternative. She had not been close to her grandfather in the way that people mean when they use the word close. They had not spoken frequently. They had not exchanged letters or visited during holidays in the easy, habitual way of families whose bonds require no maintenance. What they had shared was something quieter, and she had only understood its value after the distance between them had grown long enough that crossing it required actual effort. When she was 8 years old, she had spent a summer at his house, while her parents navigated a period of difficulty that was described to her at the time as a situation, and which she later understood to have been a separation that almost became something permanent. That summer, her grandfather had not spoken to her about the difficulty. He had not asked her how she was feeling, or reminded her that things would improve. What he had done was take her with him each morning to the workshop behind the house, where he spent his hours in the kind of focused, physical work that requires full attention and leaves no room for excess thought. She had learned that summer what it meant to commit your hands to something, to measure twice, to apply pressure in the right direction, to understand that most things that appear solid have a logic to them that reveals itself if you approach it correctly and do not rush. Her grandfather had not taught her these things directly. He had simply worked, and she had watched, and the watching had become its own form of instruction. By the end of that summer, and she could tell by the sound of a nail being driven whether the wood beneath it was hollow or solid. She could identify the grain direction of a plank by running her thumb across it. She could distinguish the smell of old wood from new and understand what each told you about the history of a thing. When she left at the end of August, her grandfather had placed his hand briefly on her shoulder and said nothing. She had understood this as more than she could have articulated then, and she still understood it that way. Now, years later, standing in her apartment in the dark, turning the sealed envelope over in her hands, she drove out the following Saturday morning, leaving before sunrise so that the familiar anxiety of being observed would not have time to settle. The drive took 3 hours through terrain that flattened and then gradually reasserted itself into the low hills she remembered, the kind that suggested effort without drama, presence without spectacle. The light was gray and steady when she arrived. The gravel road accepted her tires with the same indifference it always had. The house was empty. Not abandoned. The utilities had been kept on through the estate, and the front porch retained the arrangement of furniture her grandfather had never changed. The 2 wooden chairs angled slightly toward the open air, as if expecting company, but empty in the way that a space becomes empty when the person whose presence organized it is gone. The absence was not dramatic. It was simply there, the way his presence had always been there. A complete and self-sufficient, and requiring nothing from her to be real. She did not go inside immediately. She stood in the driveway for a while, her car door still open behind her, and looked at the house and the property and the light moving through the tree line beyond the back fence. Everything was familiar in the particular way of places, seen clearly in childhood and imperfectly in memory. The proportions slightly wrong, the distances either shorter or longer than expected, but the essential character intact. The workshop was behind the house, set back from it by perhaps 50 feet, connected by a packed dirt path that she remembered her grandfather walking every morning with the same deliberate pace, his coffee cup in one hand, his keys in the other. The building was low and wide, so constructed from cinder block on a poured foundation, with a corrugated metal roof that had weathered from galvanized silver to a muted gray that blended easily with the surrounding landscape. 2 small windows faced the house. The door faced the path. She opened the sealed envelope from her coat pocket and removed the key. It was a simple key, brass, worn along the bow where it had been held repeatedly. The same kind of key used for the same kind of padlock for 60 years in hardware stores across every county in the country. There was nothing extraordinary about it. It fit the lock on the workshop door with the easy familiarity of a thing that had been used countless times, and the lock opened with a single motion. The smell that reached her when she pushed the door open was the smell she remembered, sawdust and machine oil, and the faint metallic edge of tools cleaned and stored properly, and left to age in the contained warmth of a closed space. The smell was so precisely correct that it stopped her for a moment in the doorway, not from sentiment exactly, but from the recognition that some things remain intact over time in ways that people rarely do. The interior was organized with the methodical completeness of a person who thought spatially and never needed to search twice for anything. Tools hung on pegboard walls, each outlined in pencil, so that any absence would be immediately obvious. Lumber was stacked by dimension on low wooden brackets along the back wall. A workbench ran the full length of the right side of the room, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, and scarred in places by cuts and clamps and the accumulated record of work done carefully but not gently. And there, in the back left corner of the room, positioned on the floor, with its long axis perpendicular to the wall, was the footlocker. She recognized it immediately, though she could not have explained precisely why. It was not an unusual object. It was the kind of military surplus footlocker that had once been manufactured by the millions and distributed to young men going places they had not chosen, a heavy-gauge steel box with hinged lid and a recessed handle at each end, and a hasp lock at the front. The surface was olive green beneath a patina of grime and age that had softened the color toward something closer to brown. Stenciled letters on the lid, white paint worn to ghosts. It spelled out a name and a serial number she did not recognize. Not her grandfather's name, someone else's entirely. She crouched in front of it and looked at the stenciling more carefully. The letters were large and angular in the military style, cut with a template rather than drawn freehand. The name above the serial number was a common surname, unremarkable. Beneath it, smaller letters that she had to tilt her head to read in the low morning light spelled out a unit designation and what appeared to be a base of origin. The footlocker had not begun with her grandfather. It had come from somewhere else, traveled some distance to reach this corner of this workshop, and been kept here through the kind of deliberate retention that does not happen accidentally. A person does not hold on to a thing like this for 60 years without intention. She tested the hasp. It was latched, but not locked. The clasp lifted without resistance, and she noted that the hinges, when she pressed lightly against the lid, moved with the ease of mechanisms that had been periodically oiled rather than left to seize. Her grandfather had maintained the footlocker the way he maintained everything in this room. Not as a preserved relic, but as a functional object. She did not open it yet. She stood and moved around it slowly, examining the exterior. The corners had been reinforced at some point, small metal brackets affixed over the original seams, the work done neatly, but with materials slightly mismatched from the original manufacture. The brackets were newer than the box, their finish less weathered, the screws driven with a precision that suggested a careful hand rather than a hurried repair. And someone had reinforced the structure deliberately, protecting it against the stress that accumulated in corners over decades of use. On the bottom edge of the front face, just above the floor, she noticed something she would have missed entirely if she had not been crouching. A thin seam, horizontal, running the full width of the box, approximately 4 inches above the base. The seam was not a visible crack or a gap in the material. It was subtle, a slight inconsistency in the surface texture where the grime had settled differently along a line that did not correspond to any obvious structural feature of the original design. She pressed her fingertip along the line. The surface there was smooth in a way that suggested a fitted edge rather than a simple surface irregularity, as if 2 pieces of material met along that line precisely enough to almost eliminate any gap, but not quite perfectly enough to be invisible to someone who was looking closely and had learned, a long time ago, to distinguish between wood that was hollow and wood that was solid. She sat back on her heels and looked at the footlocker for a long moment. The morning light through the small windows had grown slightly brighter, and the workshop around her carried its familiar smell and its familiar order, and everything about the situation suggested that she was simply looking at an old military storage box in a dead man's workshop, full of the accumulated objects of a private life, and that the horizontal seam near the base was probably the result of age and stress and the ordinary deterioration of materials held under decades of atmospheric pressure. She told herself this was a reasonable interpretation. She did not entirely believe it. She stood and went back to her car to retrieve the bag she had packed before leaving, which contained a flashlight, a notepad, a pair of clean cotton gloves, and the lunch she had made for herself that morning, in the particular way of a person who knows they will forget to eat if they do not prepare in advance. She ate half the lunch standing in the driveway, looking at the workshop, and then returned inside. What she found when she opened the footlocker fully was not nothing. The interior was organized with the same precision that governed the rest of the workshop. On top, unfolded with military exactness, were 3 wool blankets, olive drab, their edges still sharp despite their age. Beneath them, carefully wrapped in cloth and separated by layers of acid-free tissue paper, were documents. Letters, photographs, what appeared to be official papers of some kind. At the bottom, arranged along the length of the interior, were personal effects of the kind that a person carries when they go somewhere they might not return from. A small Bible with a cracked spine, a pocket knife with a bone handle, a tin of hardened tobacco, a watch with a broken crystal, its hands stopped, its face scratched, but legible. None of it belonged to her grandfather. The Bible had a name inscribed in the front cover, the same name as the stenciling on the lid. The watch had an engraving on the case back, a date, initials, and the kind of inscription made by people who believe the person receiving the gift will be holding it long enough for it to acquire meaning. She lifted the items out carefully, setting them on the workbench in the order she removed them, preserving the arrangement. The cloth wrapping each document bundle was cotton, old but clean, tied with cord rather than tape, in a way that allowed access without damage. She did not unwrap anything. She examined the exteriors, noted the visible dates on the few documents that had partially visible headers, and returned each item to the workbench in sequence. When the footlocker was empty, she picked up the flashlight and shone it into the interior. The inside walls were lined with a thin wooden panel, fitted tongue and groove, the wood pale and tight-grained. Installed at some point after the original manufacture, it was not factory work, it was custom. Installed by a careful hand into the steel interior, secured at the edges with small brass screws, driven flush and slightly countersunk. She tapped the bottom panel. The sound it returned was the wrong sound. Not hollow, not solid in the way of thick wood or steel, but something between the two. A slightly muffled response that suggested a void beneath the panel rather than the structural base of the box immediately below it. She set the flashlight down and put the cotton gloves on. She ran her gloved fingers along the edge of the bottom panel, pressing gently at each corner, then along each side. At the back left corner, the wood gave slightly under her pressure. Not much, less than a millimeter, but enough to confirm that the panel was not fixed at that point. She pressed more deliberately, and the corner depressed with a small mechanical response, the faintest click, barely louder than the sound of a playing card being set on a table. The bottom panel did not spring open. It shifted, slowly, rotating on a concealed hinge at the opposite corner, rising at the freed end, just enough to catch the edge of her fingertip and allow her to guide it upward. Beneath it, built into the actual base of the footlocker and sealed from above by the panel that had just been the floor, was a cavity. She held the panel up and pointed the flashlight beam downward. The cavity was shallow, no more than 3 inches deep, running the full length and width of the footlocker's interior. It was lined with the same tight-grained wood as the panel above it, dry and clean, protected by the seal of the fitted edge above. Whatever had been kept here had been kept in conditions as controlled as the interior of the footlocker itself. Protected from light, from moisture, from the slow deterioration of exposure. She did not reach inside immediately. She directed the flashlight beam along the contents slowly, the way her grandfather had taught her, without ever explaining that he was teaching her anything. Methodically, without rushing, allowing the eye to register what was present before the hand decided what to do with it. What was inside the cavity stopped her breathing for a moment that had no clear duration. She became aware, in that pause, of the sounds of the workshop around her. The faint creak of the corrugated roof adjusting to the morning's increasing warmth, the distant movement of wind through the tree line beyond the back fence, the small, ordinary sounds of a building that had been standing for decades and intended to continue standing, indifferent to what was being witnessed within it. She closed the panel slowly, guiding it back into place until she heard the soft engagement of the mechanism at the corner. The bottom of the footlocker resumed its appearance of an ordinary wooden liner. She set the flashlight down. She removed the gloves. She stood in the workshop for a long time, her hands at her sides, looking at the closed footlocker and understanding that what she had just seen could not be unseen, and that the question of what to do with it was not simple, and that simplifying it would require a kind of dishonesty she was not prepared to apply. She had come here expecting very little. Her brothers had already made clear, without saying so directly, what they believed the value of her bequest to be. Their grandfather, in their reading of his character, had given the practical men the practical things, and given the quiet granddaughter the sentimental object. And that distribution reflected the natural order of how things should pass from one generation to the next. She had not disagreed with that reading, exactly. She had simply withheld her agreement the way she had learned to withhold many things, not as a performance of resistance, but as the particular discipline of a person who has discovered that certainty held too loosely is indistinguishable from certainty not held at all. She had driven 3 hours in the early morning and arrived alone to a dead man's workshop and opened a box that no one expected to contain anything worth protecting, and she had found a hidden cavity beneath a false floor, and what was inside it had made her stop breathing. For a moment she could not have timed. She would need to return to the cavity again. She would need to look more carefully, with better light, with steadier hands, without the initial shock that had moved through her like cold air through an opened door. She would need to understand what she was seeing before she could decide what it meant, and she would need to understand what it meant before she could decide what to do. And all of that would require the same patience that her grandfather had modeled, without explanation, on every morning of that summer when she was 8 years old, and learning, without knowing she was learning it, how to approach the things that mattered with the care they deserved. She picked up the cotton gloves and put them back in her bag. She closed the workshop door behind her and locked it with the brass key and stood in the driveway, with the morning grown full around her, the light flat and clear, the gravel road extending in both directions toward everything it had always extended toward. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from her older brother. She put it back in her pocket without listening to the messages. When she drove into town and found a hardware store that opened early on Saturdays and bought a better flashlight, the kind with adjustable focus and a battery indicator, along with a magnifying glass, a small pry tool with a padded tip, and a fresh box of nitrile gloves more durable than the cotton pair she had brought. She also bought a notebook with a stiff cover and 2 good pens. She sat in the parking lot of the hardware store and wrote down everything she had observed so far, in order, without interpretation. The dimensions of the Footlocker as best she could estimate them, the stenciled name and the partial unit designation, the corner reinforcements and the materials used, the interior liner and the type of wood, the location of the concealed mechanism and the approximate depth of the cavity, or the condition of the contents as she had observed them with the flashlight beam before closing the panel. She wrote without editorializing, the way she had been taught to document in her work at the county health department, where the difference between what was observed and what was inferred was a distinction that occasionally mattered and always should. When she was done, she read what she had written once and then closed the notebook. Then she drove back to the house and returned to the workshop. The Footlocker sat exactly as she had left it, which she noted with a mild awareness that she had half expected it not to. Objects that hold things you were not expecting do not typically stay still in memory, even when they stay still in fact. The quality of stillness looks different after a discovery, or it acquires a kind of tension that the ordinary stillness of a room at rest does not carry. She opened the workshop door wider this time, propping it with a block of wood she found near the entrance, allowing the full morning light to fall across the floor. She positioned herself on the left side of the Footlocker and put on the nitrile gloves and opened the lid again. She removed the contents methodically, returning them to the workbench in the same order as before, handling each bundle with the attention of someone who has been told, implicitly and explicitly, that the things inside matter and should be treated accordingly. With the Footlocker empty, she opened the false floor panel again. This time, she positioned the new flashlight to cast its beam at an oblique angle, which brought the contents into relief rather than simply illuminating them directly. The technique was one she had read about once in an article about document preservation and had stored in the particular part of her memory reserved for information that has no immediate application but feels worth keeping. The contents of the hidden cavity, viewed this way, in good light, with steady hands and a clear head, were something she would spend the next several days trying to organize into a coherent understanding of what they meant and how they came to be here. But on that first full examination, what she understood clearly enough was this. The cavity contained multiple rows of items, each wrapped separately and placed with care. Some were rectangular, flat and thin, wrapped in a material that had protected them from the marginal moisture of decades. Others were cylindrical, small and dense, wrapped in cloth that had yellowed but not deteriorated. At the far end of the cavity, lying flat and taking up the full width of that end, was something larger than the others, wrapped in multiple layers of the same protective material, tied at both ends, handled by someone who understood that what was inside required a level of care that ordinary objects do not. She did not unwrap anything that afternoon. She sat beside the open footlocker on the workshop floor for a long time, her back against the wall beneath the pegboard, the flashlight resting across her knees with its beam aimed at the ceiling. The afternoon light through the small windows had shifted to the lower angle of late afternoon, when the workshop had taken on the particular quality of a space that has been inhabited consistently and is comfortable with presence. She thought about her grandfather, about the way he had worked, and the way he had watched her learn, and the way he had placed his hand on her shoulder at the end of that summer, without saying anything that needed to be said. She thought about the footlocker, and the name stenciled on its lid, and the careful reinforcement of its corners, and the lining installed inside it, and the mechanism built into its floor. She thought about the specific detail, which she was only now allowing herself to fully absorb, that her grandfather had not simply kept this object in his workshop for 60 years. He had maintained it. He had returned to it repeatedly, with oil for the hinges, and with the continued attention of someone who intended the object to function correctly when eventually it needed to be used. She thought about the cavity, about what was in it, about the fact that her grandfather had left the footlocker to her specifically, named in a legal document prepared with deliberate care, and that her brothers had received what the estate contained in the conventional sense, and that the distribution had been made by a man who thought spatially and never needed to search twice for anything, and had spent a summer teaching her, without explaining that he was teaching her, the difference between what was hollow and what was solid. She closed the panel. She closed the footlocker. She relocked the hasp. Outside, the afternoon light was fading. The gravel road caught the last of it at a low angle, and the house behind her was quiet in the way that houses become quiet when they no longer have anyone whose return they are waiting for. The drive back into town that evening took longer than it should have. She did not rush. She moved through the small roads that connected her grandfather's property to the wider world at the pace of someone still thinking, the headlights cutting a narrow corridor through the early dark, the fields on either side of the road settling into the indistinct gray-black of a countryside without much artificial light. She had always found driving useful for the kind of thinking that required motion. Still, rooms had a way of consolidating uncertainty into anxiety, pressing it inward until it became something harder and less manageable. Odd roads allowed the same uncertainty to remain distributed, spread out over the distance traveled, neither resolved nor amplified. She found she could hold complicated things more steadily when the ground was moving beneath her. What she was holding now was complicated in the particular way of things that do not yet have language. She had observed something. She had not yet named it, because naming it required a level of certainty she had not yet reached, and reaching it prematurely would only complicate the process of understanding what she actually had. This was a discipline she had learned, not in any formal way, but through the accumulated experience of being a person who had been wrong about important things and had noticed, over time, the specific conditions under which being wrong most often occurred. She had been wrong by naming things before she knew them fully. She had been wrong by accepting the names that other people applied before she had applied her own. She had been wrong in both directions, overclaiming and underclaiming, and the distance between the two errors had gradually taught her the shape of the middle space where accuracy lived. The middle space, right now, contained the following: an old military footlocker in a dead man's workshop, bearing a name that was not her grandfather's, reinforced and maintained over decades, fitted inside with a custom wooden liner and a concealed panel that opened via a mechanical latch, beneath which lay a cavity containing items wrapped with deliberate care. She could name all of that. The observable fact of it required no interpretation and admitted no reasonable doubt. So what the items in the cavity were, and what they were worth, and how they came to be there, and what her grandfather had understood about them when he maintained the footlocker for 60 years and left it to her in a legal document. Those were questions that belonged to the other side of the middle space, the side that required more work before anything should be concluded. She ate dinner alone in the one restaurant in her grandfather's town that she remembered from her summer there, a counter-service place that had not changed its menu in the intervening decades and did not seem to consider this a deficiency. The woman behind the counter was older than she remembered, but recognizably the same person, and she did not ask whether the granddaughter of the man on the gravel road was doing all right following his passing, which was a form of consideration that she was quietly grateful for. After dinner, she returned to the house and let herself in with the key from the attorney's envelope, which turned out to contain not only the workshop key, but the house key as well, tucked into a second sleeve she had not noticed until now. She walked through the rooms without turning on many lights. The house had the quality of a space whose owner had never been particularly interested in accumulation, and so it did not feel crowded with absence the way some houses do. What was there was what had always been there. What had been removed by time was not replaced by clutter or gesture. She slept in her grandfather's house that night in the small bedroom that had been hers during the summer. She was 8, on a bed that had been remade at some point since then, but still occupied the same position in the room and still faced the same window, which looked out onto the backyard, and beyond it, the dark shape of the workshop roof against the lighter dark of the sky. She lay awake longer than was useful, and went over the contents of the cavity in the order she had observed them, the way she sometimes went over complex work documents before an important meeting, organizing the elements into a structure that would hold under examination. The flat rectangular items, the cylindrical ones, small and dense. The larger item at the far end, wrapped in multiple layers, handled by someone who understood its value. The dry, preserved condition of everything, the care taken with the materials protecting them. She was not an expert in anything that the cavity's contents seemed to require expertise in, but she knew how to identify the kind of care that told you something mattered to the person extending it, and everything about the cavity spoke that language fluently. By the time she finally slept, the night was far along, and the workshop roof outside the window was invisible against a sky that had clouded over, and the silence of the property was the kind of silence that does not need anything from you to continue. She rose early, before the gray light had fully committed to the day, and made coffee in her grandfather's kitchen, using a machine that was older than several of her previous apartments, and functioned with an unhurried reliability that suggested it had never been asked to hurry and did not intend to start. She stood at the kitchen window, with the cup in both hands, and looked out at the workshop and the yard and the tree line, and thought about the question she had not yet been able to stop thinking about. Why her? Not in the sense of why she deserved it, which was a question she had long ago learned to set aside in favor of more answerable ones, but in the factual sense. Her brothers were older. They were men in the way their grandfather had been a man, practical and comfortable in spaces that rewarded practicality, and their grandfather had not been a person who made sentimental distinctions between the sexes when it came to the distribution of anything that mattered. He had been fair in the precise way of someone who thought about fairness as a structural concern rather than an emotional one. So, why her? Why the Footlocker? Why the specific, named, legally documented bequest that set aside from the distribution of liquid assets and real property one particular object, one particular item, and directed it toward the one person in the family who had spent a summer learning to hear the difference between hollow and solid? The coffee was good. She finished it and washed the cup and placed it in the drying rack beside the sink, and then walked out across the yard and unlocked the workshop and went inside. She took out her phone. There were 3 missed calls now, 2 from the older brother, 1 from the younger. She opened her contacts and called someone else instead. A person she trusted in the specific and limited way of someone who has been careful enough about trust to know when it is warranted and to extend it only then. The call connected, and she spoke without preamble. She said that she had found something in her grandfather's workshop and that she needed help understanding what she was looking at before she did anything else. She said that she did not want anyone else to know about it yet. She said she would explain everything when there was a face to explain it to. There was a pause on the other end. Then a question, asked quietly, in the tone of someone who takes the person they are speaking with seriously. She answered the question honestly, which was the only way she had ever known how to answer anything. Then she locked the workshop, pocketed the key, and stood in the failing light of a Sunday morning outside her grandfather's house, holding the phone at her side and looking at the workshop door and understanding that whatever came next would not be simple, and that simplicity had probably never been the point. Her grandfather had built a mechanism into the floor of an old footlocker that bore another man's name and had maintained that mechanism through 6 decades of ordinary life, and had arranged before his death for the one person in his family who understood the difference between hollow and solid to be the one who found what was inside it. She did not yet know what that meant in the full, practical sense, but she knew that it was not nothing. She had known that from the moment the panel gave way beneath her fingertip and the flashlight beam fell across what lay beneath, and the knowledge had changed the quality of the air in the room around her in a way that was impossible to describe to someone who had not been in that particular room at that particular moment and seen what she had seen. She walked back toward the house. The gravel crunched under her feet the way it always had. The morning was gray and still. The tree line stood at the edge of the property, patient and indifferent, as it had always stood. Behind her, the workshop held its silence the way it had always held it, neither volunteering nor concealing, simply waiting, as her grandfather had always waited, for the right question to be asked in the right way at the right time. The person she had called arrived the following Tuesday. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was 71 years old and had spent 40 years working in the authentication and provenance division of a regional auction house before retiring to a property 2 counties over from her grandfather's town, where he kept a garden that produced more tomatoes than any reasonable person could consume, and a workshop of his own in which he restored antique timepieces with a patience that his former colleagues had always found either admirable or unsettling, depending on the colleague. She had met him through her work at the county health department, where a records project had briefly intersected with the estate of a deceased collector whose belongings Gerald had been retained to assess. He had been precise and unhurried and had spoken to her as though she were capable of understanding complex things correctly if they were explained without condescension, which was not a quality she encountered with enough frequency to take for granted. She had not told him on the phone what she had found. She had told him only that she had found something and that she needed a second set of eyes before she made any decisions. He had not asked her to be more specific. He had asked only whether the something was fragile and whether it was currently in a controlled environment. And when she had answered yes to both, He had said he would come on Tuesday and had asked for the address. He drove himself in a truck older than most of the roads he traveled, and he arrived at the gravel property exactly at the time he had said he would arrive, which was 7 in the morning. She had coffee waiting, and he drank it standing at the kitchen window the same way she had, looking out at the workshop and the yard and the tree line with the attentive stillness of a man who had spent a professional lifetime being paid to look at things before touching them. She had spent the days between the call and his arrival in a state of careful restraint. She had returned to the Footlocker each morning and evening and opened the false floor panel and directed her flashlight beam across the contents of the cavity with the focused attention of someone cataloging rather than exploring. She had added to her notebook. She had researched the stenciled name on the lid and the unit designation beneath it, using the tools available to a person with a county health department employee's facility for navigating public records and a library card that gave her access to digitized military archives. What she found was consistent with what the Footlocker suggested. A young man, a particular conflict, a particular theater of that conflict, a period of service that ended in a manner the records described in the bureaucratic shorthand that military archives used for the kind of ending that left families waiting for letters that did not come. She had not been able to determine the connection between that young man and her grandfather. The records stopped where direct documentation stopped, which was the nature of records from that period and that distance. But the Footlocker was in the workshop. The Footlocker had been maintained. The Footlocker had been left to her. The connection existed. She simply did not yet have the language for it. Gerald finished his coffee and set the cup on the counter with a small sound of finality and said he was ready when she was. She led him across the yard to the workshop and unlocked the door and propped it open as she had before. Gerald did not comment on the workshop itself, though she noticed his gaze moving across the organized tools and the stacked lumber and the workbench in the way of someone reading a room for what it tells you about the person who inhabited it. He registered what he saw without sharing the registration, which was a quality she respected. She indicated the Footlocker in the back left corner. Gerald did not approach it immediately. He circled the room once with his hands in his jacket pockets, taking in the context, the arrangement, the spatial relationship between the Footlocker and everything else in the space. Then he crouched in front of it and read the stenciling with the same tilted head attention she had used, and she watched his expression remain neutral in a way that required effort rather than the absence of reaction. He touched the corner reinforcements with one gloved fingertip. He examined the hasp. He traced the outer seam she had identified near the base, applying light pressure along its length. Then he looked up at her. She said she had not yet opened anything inside the cavity. She said everything was as she had found it. He nodded once and said they should bring better light. They spent 20 minutes repositioning the 2 work lights from the workshop ceiling so that their beams fell across the Footlocker from 2 angles rather than 1. Gerald produced from his jacket pocket a folding magnifying lens of the kind used by jewelers, compact and high quality, its handle worn with long use. He put on his own gloves, a thin pair of white cotton, and he moved the folding stool from beside the workbench and sat on it in front of the Footlocker and opened the lid. She stood to his left and slightly back. She had decided before he arrived that she would let him look first and speak second, and she held to that decision now. Gerald removed the contents of the Footlocker in the same order. She had removed them, but more slowly, handling each item with the automatic precision of someone for whom the handling of old and potentially significant objects was not a careful act, but a habitual one. The wool blankets, the wrapped document bundles, the personal effects at the bottom. He did not unwrap or open anything on the first pass. He set each item on the workbench with the same deliberate spacing, creating a linear arrangement that allowed each object to be seen as part of a sequence. When the Footlocker was empty, He directed the beam of his own flashlight, a thin, high-intensity instrument from another jacket pocket, into the interior, moving it slowly across the wooden liner. He tapped the bottom panel in several places and listened to the sounds it returned with the focused attention of a physician listening to a chest. He found the mechanism at the back left corner on his first deliberate attempt, pressing with a firmness that suggested he had encountered concealed panels before and understood where mechanisms were most economically placed. The panel rose. Gerald held it open with one hand and directed his flashlight beam into the cavity with the other. The silence that followed lasted longer than the silence she had experienced when she first opened the panel herself. Gerald looked for a very long time without speaking. When he finally straightened and lowered the panel back into place, he set his flashlight on the workbench and pressed both hands flat against the wood for a moment, as if grounding himself. Then he turned to look at her. He asked how long she had known about the cavity. She told him. 5 days. And he asked if she had touched anything inside it. She said no. She said she had used a flashlight from 2 angles and had not entered the cavity with her hands. He asked if anyone else knew. She said no. He picked up his flashlight again and reopened the panel and knelt beside the footlocker and began, very slowly, to remove the first item from the cavity. The flat rectangular package was approximately the size of a hardcover book, wrapped in what Gerald identified, after a moment's examination, as a sulfite-free archival sleeve of the kind used by professional conservators, enclosed then in cotton batting and then in a layer of waxed linen cloth tied with cotton cord. The outer layers had aged and yellowed, but they had done the job they were designed to do. When Gerald untied the cord and folded back the linen cloth and then the cotton batting and then parted the edges of the archival sleeve, what was inside had been protected from the cumulative deterioration of 60 or more years. He handled the inner contents, a flat, rigid object approximately 9 inches by 12, with both hands, tilting it carefully toward the adjusted work lights. She had to recalibrate what she was seeing. She had looked at reproductions of such things in books and on screens. She knew the vocabulary of the form, the period, the style, the particular conventions of the medium. But the difference between a reproduction and the thing itself, when the thing itself is held by a careful person under good light in a small workshop in a county where nothing like this had any obvious reason to exist, was not a difference that intellectual preparation fully covers. Gerald said nothing for a time. He turned the piece slowly, examining the edges, the surface, the back. He produced the jeweler's loupe from his pocket and used it on a small area near the lower left, where the condition of the surface differed very slightly from the rest. He was there with the loupe for a long time. Then he set the piece down, flat on the cotton batting, and looked at her again with an expression she did not know how to classify. It was not excitement. It was something more interior than excitement, more considered, the expression of a person who has seen many things and has arrived at a state of being able to hold a significant thing without the response outrunning the assessment. He said he would need to look at everything before he said anything definitive. She said she understood. They worked through the rest of the morning. There were 11 flat packages in total, each wrapped in the same archival materials, each protected with the same layered care. The packages varied in size, the smallest barely larger than a sheet of printer paper, the largest approximately 18 inches on its long side. Gerald removed each one in sequence, opened each one with the same patience, examined each one under the work lights and the loupe. He said nothing as he worked except occasional quiet instructions. Could she tilt the light slightly? Could she hold the end of the cotton batting? Could she hand him the smaller of the 2 flashlights? The cylindrical items, 8 of them, were wrapped in chamois cloth. Gerald unwrapped the first and held it up to the light, and turned it in his fingers for a long time. She could see it clearly enough. A small cylinder of yellow gold color, stamped at each end, its surface bearing the particular soft luster of a material that does not tarnish and does not lie. Gerald set it beside the first painting. She had allowed herself the word now that he had examined several, and unwrapped another cylinder. Then another. The larger item from the far end of the cavity was the last thing he removed. It took him several minutes to unfold the multiple layers of protection, working steadily and without hurrying, and when the final layer was back and the piece lay revealed under the work lights, she heard him breathe differently, just once. A small and involuntary intake that was the only outward sign he offered of what he was seeing. It was larger than the others, and it was different in character. Where the others were oil on panel or oil on canvas of modest dimension, this was larger, and its execution was of an unmistakable confidence, the kind that does not come from technical training alone, but from a command of the form that moves past technique into something else. Gerald brought the work light closer. He used the loupe for a long time on the lower right corner. He stood and stepped back and looked at it from a greater distance. He crouched and examined the back. He did all of this without speaking. When he was done, he covered the piece again carefully, laying the protective materials back over it with the same precision with which they had been removed. Well, he covered the other pieces. He closed the false floor panel. He looked at his watch. It was past noon. He said they should eat something before he tried to explain what he believed he was looking at. They sat in her grandfather's kitchen at the same table she had eaten at 30 years ago, and she heated soup from a can because she had not thought to bring much food, and neither had he, and they ate together without speaking until the bowls were empty. Then she put the bowls in the sink and sat back down and waited. Gerald folded his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then looked at her. He said he was going to speak carefully, and that she should ask him to stop and clarify at any point where she wanted more precision. She said she understood. He said that the 11 flat packages contained works that he believed to be original paintings. He said that several of them bore characteristics consistent with periods and styles that placed them in a range extending from the early 17th century to the late 18th. He said that one of them, he would not name it yet, bore characteristics that he found extraordinary, and that required verification before he would be comfortable with the description he was already applying to it privately. She asked about the cylindrical objects. He said that the cylindrical objects were gold. He said they were consistent with the dimensions and markings of standard 1 troy-ounce gold rounds of a type that had been produced by several private mints throughout the mid-20th century. He said there were 8 of them, which at current spot price represented a value that wasn't nothing, but wasn't the central matter either. She said she understood. He said the central matter was the paintings. He said that establishing provenance for works of this age and potential significance was a process that involved multiple layers of documentation, scientific analysis, and institutional verification, and that he would not be providing her with final numbers today. He said that the process wasn't quick and wasn't simple, and that the results would depend on what the documents in the Footlocker's main compartment contained, because works like these did not exist in isolation from their history, and history left paper, and paper sometimes survived. But he looked at her steadily and said that she should understand that he was speaking to her as a professional who had assessed many things and misread very few of them, and that what he had seen this morning in that workshop, based on his 4 decades of experience, was not ordinary. She said she understood that. He said he wanted to be sure she understood it in the practical sense. She asked him to be specific. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the painting at the far end of the cavity, the large one, the one he had examined last and covered again carefully, if it was what he believed it might be, it was not a matter of tens of thousands of dollars. It was not a matter of hundreds of thousands. He said the word millions without drama or emphasis, the way a person says a word they have said many times and no longer needs to perform. He said that several of the others were not inconsiderable either. She sat with that for a time. The kitchen was quiet around them. The afternoon had moved past the window without her noticing. She asked what needed to happen next. Gerald said that the documents in the main compartment of the Footlocker needed to be examined carefully, because provenance was everything, and because provenance needed to be established before any formal assessment could proceed. He said she should not move the works or the gold from the workshop until there was a proper environment to receive them. He said she should not speak to anyone, about what was in the cavity until she had legal representation she trusted, because the moment other people knew the nature of what she had, the complexity would multiply in ways that would require management she could not provide for herself alone. She thought about her brother's voicemails, about the attorney's conference room, about the geometry of the moment when the older brother had made the sound that was not quite a laugh. She did not say any of this. She asked Gerald if he could recommend a conservator, someone who could come to the workshop and assess the works in their current location before anything was moved. He said he could. He said there was a woman he trusted in a city 3 hours away, who had worked with several regional museums, and whose discretion he could vouch for personally. She said to contact her. He said he would, and then he said something she had not expected. He said that he owed her an acknowledgement. He said that in 40 years of work, he had been called to look at a great many things that people believed were significant, and had arrived to find that most of them were not, or were significant in smaller and more manageable ways than the people who called him hoped. He said that this was different. He picked up his coffee cup, which had been empty for an hour, and looked at the bottom of it, as though considering whether to make more, and then set it down. He said, "Your grandfather knew what he had." She thought about the workshop door, propped open on mornings she could still feel in her hands, the smell of sawdust and machine oil, the way her grandfather moved through space as though he had never needed to hurry, because he had always already been where he was going. She said, yes, and I think he did. The conservator arrived 4 days later. Her name was Dr. Adaise Okoye, and she was 46 years old, and had the focused efficiency of someone whose professional life had trained her to arrive at decisions quickly, without having the decisions be careless. She brought with her 2 cases of equipment, and a graduate student she introduced only as Marcus, who said nothing and moved carefully, and was clearly very good at both. Gerald was there as well. He had driven over the morning before and stayed at the single motel in the nearest town, which he said was perfectly acceptable in the specific way of a person who has stopped expecting accommodations to be anything other than functional. The examination of the cavity's contents by Dr. Okoye and Marcus occupied the better part of 2 full days. She had established the workshop as the examination space, clearing the workbench entirely and covering it with the acid-free paper that Dr. Okoye had brought, creating a clean surface of sufficient size to work on. The Footlocker remained in its corner. The pieces were brought out one at a time, examined, documented photographically with the equipment Marcus managed, and returned. She watched from the doorway during much of this, her notebook open, adding to what she had already written. Gerald stood beside her at intervals and spoke quietly, explaining what he observed in Dr. Okoye's process, when explanation seemed useful. She absorbed it without interruption, asking her questions during the pauses in the examination rather than across it. On the afternoon of the second day, Dr. Okoye asked her to come inside and stand at the workbench. The large piece was laid out before her, fully uncovered, under the combined illumination of the work lights and the equipment Dr. Okoye had brought. In the full light of a careful examination, with 2 days of context behind her and a conservator's assessment in progress beside her, it looked nothing like what she would have imagined in this room if she had tried to imagine it, which she had not, because some things resist imagination until they are simply in front of you in the factual and unambiguous way of objects that exist regardless of whether they are expected. Dr. Okoye pointed to specific areas of the surface with a capped pen, not touching, only indicating. She described what she was observing in precise technical language that she then translated into plain terms without being asked, which was either professional habit or a reading of the person she was addressing that turned out to be accurate. She explained the age indicators, the composition of the ground layer, visible at a small area of edge loss, the specific craquelure pattern, its character consistent with works of a particular period, the underdrawing she had identified using the equipment Marcus operated, which confirmed a working method consistent with a documented hand, the pigment analysis, still preliminary, but aligned with what the period and the proposed attribution would predict. She said the attribution was not yet confirmed. She said that confirmation would require additional analysis that she was not in a position to conduct in a workshop, and that the work would need to travel to a facility equipped for the necessary tests. She said the process could take months. Then she said that based on what she had observed over the past 2 days, her professional opinion was that several of the pieces were of substantial significance, and that one of them, she indicated the large piece currently in front of them, was potentially of exceptional importance, the kind of importance that, in her experience, occurred perhaps a handful of times in a career. She said she had seen nothing that caused her to doubt the authenticity of any of the works. She said that the documents in the Footlocker's main compartment, which she had spent an hour reviewing with Gerald, contained elements that were consistent with a provenance history that, if verified, some would place several of the works within a specific collection that had been dispersed in Europe during the Second World War, and whose contents had been the subject of documented institutional searches for more than 50 years. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished speaking. Then Gerald said what everyone in the room was already thinking. He said the word carefully, in the manner of someone who has waited until they were confident enough to say it without qualification. He said, restitution. She understood the word in its legal and historical sense. She had spent the 4 days between Gerald's first visit and Dr. Okoye's arrival reading about it. Restitution law, as it applied to cultural property. The international frameworks. The institutional bodies whose function was to evaluate claims and authenticate returns. The decades of work done by families and governments and organizations to recover what had been taken. The decades more spent establishing what had been taken and from whom and by what sequence of hands it had traveled before disappearing from the record. She understood that the Footlocker's documents might contain the thread that connected what was in the cavity to that history, that her grandfather had preserved that thread alongside the works themselves, wrapped with the same care, stored in the same controlled conditions. She asked Dr. Okoye directly, "What is the range of value we are discussing?" Dr. Okoye looked at Gerald. Gerald said they should be careful with numbers at this stage. She said she understood that. She asked again. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the combined value of the collection, if the attributions he and Dr. Okoye had arrived at provisionally were confirmed, and if the provenance was established and clean, was in a range that he would not put a specific ceiling on. He said the large piece alone, based on the attribution they were considering, would be in a range that would be reported internationally. He said the collection as a whole was likely to be described, when it became known, as one of the most significant, privately held rediscoveries of the past several decades. He said, "We are not discussing millions in the ordinary sense of the word. We are discussing the kind of number that changes the conversation entirely." She stood at the workbench, looking at the large piece, still uncovered, and still returning the light from the work lamps in the patient way of something that had been waiting a long time for the right conditions and was not in a hurry now that they had arrived. She thought about the attorney's conference room, the older brother's finger tapping against the table, the sound that was not quite a laugh. She thought about her grandfather placing his hand on her shoulder at the end of a summer 30 years ago, saying nothing, understanding that nothing needed to be said. She thought about the mechanism at the corner of the false panel, and the care with which it had been constructed, and the care with which it had been maintained, and the way that care had spoken to her from the moment she first pressed her fingertip along the horizontal seam near the base of the box and understood, without yet being able to say why, that the solid thing concealed a hollow space, and that the hollow space was the point. She looked at Gerald, and she looked at Dr. Okoye, and she said, "What do we do first?" Dr. Okoye said the pieces needed to move to a controlled environment. She named the facility she intended to use and said she would manage the transport personally. She said the documentation from the Footlocker needed to be examined by specialists in the specific archive and provenance field, and she could make those introductions. She said there was a legal framework that applied to works of this type and this history, and navigating it correctly from the beginning would determine how the process unfolded, and that getting legal counsel with specific expertise was not optional. Gerald said he had a name, and someone he had worked with before in a case with certain similarities, who understood the relevant law and was not in the habit of making simple things complicated or complicated things simple. She said to send her the name. He said he would send it that evening. Dr. Okoye began the careful process of returning the large piece to its protective wrappings. Marcus assisted, handling the outermost layers, while Dr. Okoye managed the contact with the surface. The motion was practiced and calm. She watched and thought about the $319 million. The number Gerald had declined to say precisely, but had allowed into the room anyway, through the careful architecture of what he had and had not confirmed. The way a person who is skilled at speaking about value speaks when they want the number to be understood, without being irresponsible about the specific digits. 319 million was not a number she had ever previously occupied any space near. It was not a number that belonged in a workshop at the end of a gravel road, in a county that did not appear in most national publications for any reason. It was not a number that had ever had occasion to share a room with her coat or her coffee cup or her stiff-covered notebook. But it was there, behind the false floor of an old footlocker, in the corner of her grandfather's workshop, left to her specifically, left to her by a man who had known it was there for 60 years and had maintained the mechanism and maintained the silence and maintained the care, and who had not given it to the practical men because the practical men did not know how to hear the difference between hollow and solid, and the knowing was everything. She said nothing of this aloud. She turned to her notebook and wrote down the steps that needed to happen next, in order, precisely, without editorializing. Legal counsel, conservator facility, document specialists, the framework for what followed. Dr. Okoye finished rewrapping the large piece and set it gently back in the cavity and lifted the false floor panel back into place until it clicked. The workshop was quiet around all four of them. Outside, through the propped door, the afternoon was moving toward evening with the slow patience of a day that had contained a great deal and was not yet finished. She closed her notebook and looked at the footlocker, now closed and latched, sitting in the corner exactly as it had always sat, bearing the stenciled name of a young man who had carried it somewhere and not returned, and offering no outward sign of what it had held and what it was about to release into the world. The evenings in her grandfather's house during those weeks had a quality she found difficult to describe later when people asked about that period. They asked because they wanted the drama of it, the crescendo. They wanted the moment when certainty arrived like weather, sudden and complete. But that was not how it had been. How it had been was slow and very still, the way all consequential things are still when they are unfolding in real time rather than in retrospect. She sat in the evenings at her grandfather's kitchen table, with the documents from the Footlocker spread before her in the order she and Gerald and Dr. Okoye had determined was most useful, and she read with the careful attention of someone who is not an expert, but understands that patience applied to a thing long enough begins to approximate expertise in the specific way of really looking. The documents told a story that was not her grandfather's story, but that had arrived in his keeping by a route she was only partially able to reconstruct. The young man whose name was on the lid of the Footlocker had been a soldier in a conflict that had moved through Europe in the mid-20th century like a hand sweeping a table, displacing everything it encountered, without distinguishing between what was precious and what was not. He had been in specific places during specific months. Some of those places, cross-referenced against what Dr. Okoye had told her about the provenance research she was conducting in parallel, were places where collections had been gathered, stored, and then dispersed by the forces that controlled them during that period. There were letters in the document bundles, handwritten on paper, that had been protected from moisture and light by the archival materials her grandfather had wrapped around them. Their ink faded, but legible. Their language direct and unadorned in the way of correspondence, written by young men who had not yet developed the literary self-consciousness that comes with age and survival. The young man had written to someone at home. He had written about what he was seeing. In one letter, dated in the autumn of a year that placed it near the end of active movement through a particular region, he had written about a storage facility his unit had been detailed to secure. He described it in a paragraph that Dr. Okoye had asked her to photograph separately and send that same evening. She had photographed it and sent it, and received back a response within 2 hours that contained more exclamation points than she had ever seen in a professional communication from Dr. Okoye, which told her something about the paragraph's content and the weight it carried. There were also papers of a different kind, not letters, but records. Transfer documents, inventory notes, the kind of administrative paperwork that military operations generated in enormous quantities, and that someone had removed from wherever administrative paperwork was supposed to reside, and placed instead inside a Footlocker that subsequently traveled across an ocean and ended up in a workshop in a county that did not appear in most national publications for any reason. How the Footlocker had come to her grandfather was a question she could trace partially, but not completely. There were photographs in the document bundles, not the personal photographs she had seen on first examination, but documentary ones, taken with the pragmatic framing of someone recording facts rather than moments. They showed spaces, objects, arrangements. Some of the objects in those photographs corresponded to what was in the cavity. The correspondence was not speculative. It was visual and direct. A person looking at the photographs and looking at the works could see that they were the same things in different contexts, separated by time and distance and the particular kind of care that her grandfather had applied to everything in his possession that he believed deserved it. She did not know what the young man had intended. She did not know whether he had survived to make any intention real. The records she had found in the public archives suggested the short, bureaucratic answer to that question, and she had not pressed harder than the public archives allowed, because pressing harder was a task for people with specific expertise in exactly that kind of history, and she had arranged by then to put the documents in front of exactly those people. What she understood, on sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, was that her grandfather had received something from somewhere, that he had understood its nature, that he had understood its value in both the specific monetary sense and in the larger historical sense, which was the sense that Dr. Okoye had invoked when she used the word restitution, that he had preserved it with the same methodical care he brought to everything in his workshop, and that he had left it to the grandchild who had spent a summer learning the difference between hollow and solid, which was not a sentimental choice. It was a precise one. He had known she would find it. He had known she would approach it correctly. He had known that she would not rush, would not make claims before she had the evidence to support them. Ida would not allow the weight of the moment to distort the precision of the response. He had known all of this because he had watched her, and watching carefully was his primary skill, and she had inherited it directly from him in the specific way that the things worth inheriting are always transmitted, without ceremony, without declaration, through the accumulated exposure of time spent together doing work that required full attention. The attorney she retained, whose name Gerald had sent her on the evening of Dr. Okoye's examination, was a woman named Catherine Sue, who specialized in cultural property law and had worked on restitution cases across 3 continents over a 20-year career. She had short gray hair and a phone voice that conveyed competence without effort, and a tendency to ask one very specific question at a time and wait for the complete answer before asking the next one, which was a conversational style that suited the situation and the person she was dealing with. Catherine had arrived at the workshop on the 5th day after Dr. Okoye's examination and had spent 4 hours reviewing the documents, communicating by photograph and encrypted message with colleagues in 2 other countries, and making notes in a legal pad with the focused economy of someone who knows what matters and does not write down what doesn't. At the end of those 4 hours, she had called her outside to the yard, and they had stood in the pale afternoon light, and Catherine had told her what the situation was. The situation was serious and historical and manageable. It was serious because the provenance trail, if it went where the documents suggested, connected the collection to a family whose documented losses during the war period had been the subject of formal restitution proceedings in 2 countries for more than 3 decades, and whose current representatives had resources and institutional allies, and a legal team that had been pursuing recovery of the collection's components for longer than she had been alive. It was historical because those proceedings had stalled repeatedly on the absence of the specific documentation now sitting in a workshop in her grandfather's county. And it was manageable because she had done everything correctly. She had not moved the works. She had not spoken publicly. She had engaged professional counsel before making any claims. She had preserved the chain of evidence. Catherine said that the process ahead was not going to be fast. She said it was going to involve lawyers and institutions and governments, and the kind of patience that the situation required of everyone involved, including her. She said that at the conclusion of a correctly managed process, the collection would need to return to its rightful owners, or to the institutions designated to receive it on their behalf, and that the manner of that return would determine what she received in recognition of the preservation that had made the return possible. She had asked, "And what does that look like?" Catherine had said it looked like a number agreed upon through negotiation, governed by the legal frameworks applicable in the relevant jurisdictions, and that the number would reflect the significance of what had been preserved and the completeness of the documentation and the good faith of the process. She had asked whether Gerald's provisional estimate was in the range of what Catherine was anticipating. Catherine had looked at the tree line for a moment. Then she had said, "I would consider Gerald's estimate a reasonable floor." She had understood what that meant. She stood in the yard in the pale light and understood what it meant to have been given, specifically and deliberately, and without drama, a box that no one expected to contain anything worth protecting. She understood what it meant to have been the person who heard the wrong sound when she tapped the panel. She understood what it meant to have pressed her fingertip along a horizontal seam and known, without yet being able to say why, that the solid thing concealed a hollow space and that the hollow space was the point. The process was going to take time, the confirmation of attributions, the verification of provenance, the legal negotiations between parties, whose claims and interests were complex and legitimate, and required careful management by people who understood the specific frameworks that governed this kind of situation. None of it would happen in a week or a month. Catherine had been direct about that. But the first steps had been taken correctly. The documents were in the hands of specialists. The works were being transported by Dr. Okoye to the controlled facility, where the necessary scientific analysis would proceed. The legal representation was engaged. The framework was in place. And in the corner of her grandfather's workshop, where the Footlocker had sat for 60 years, bearing its stenciled name and offering no outward sign of what it contained, the space it had occupied was now simply empty floor, clean and swept, the same packed dirt and poured concrete as the rest of the room, looking like what it was. The space where something important had been kept until the right person came for it. She locked the workshop one last time that evening and stood in the yard for a while with the key in her hand. The light was going. The tree line was darkening. The property was quiet around her in the way it had always been quiet, self-contained and patient, asking nothing of the person standing in it. She thought about her grandfather's hand on her shoulder, the summer she was 8, the smell of sawdust and machine oil, the sound a nail makes when it's driven into hollow wood, and the different sound it makes when it meets something solid. She put the key in her pocket and walked back toward the house. The older brother called 7 times in the 2 weeks after she left her grandfather's property that first time. She listened to all of the messages in sequence one evening and then deleted them without responding. They followed a progression she found predictable and, in a way she was not proud of finding it, almost instructive. The first 2 were casual in tone, friendly even, asking how she was doing, mentioning that there was some paperwork related to the estate, that Catherine, the estate attorney, different from Catherine Sue, whose existence her brothers did not know about, had flagged as requiring signatures from all 3 grandchildren. The third shifted slightly, the friendliness acquiring a slightly more deliberate quality, the way a person's smile shifts when it is being applied, rather than arriving naturally. The fourth asked whether she had gone out to the property yet, and what condition the workshop was in, because he was thinking of listing the house and land soon, and wanted to move the process forward. The fifth was shorter, less carefully assembled, the friendliness set aside in favor of a more direct register. He said he hoped she was not planning to complicate things. The sixth said that the Footlocker was probably worth going through carefully before it was discarded. He used the word discarded without apparent awareness of what it communicated about the assumption beneath it. The seventh was 4 sentences long. He said the estate was being finalized. He said her portion had been received. He said if there was anything in the workshop she wanted, she should let him know by end of week. He said anything not claimed would be disposed of when the property transferred. She sat with the phone in her lap for a while after the 7th message, looking at the ceiling of her apartment. The light was the flat, even light of a late afternoon, in a room that did not get direct sun at that hour. Everything in the room was exactly as she had left it. Nothing had changed in the observable way of rooms left untouched. She understood that the messages were not malicious in the way that deliberate harm is malicious. They were something quieter, and in some ways more instructive. They were the architecture of an assumption, the assumption that she was peripheral, that what she had been given was peripheral, that the distribution of her grandfather's estate had been correctly weighted by people who understood how weight was properly distributed. The assumption was not personal, it was structural. It had been built over a long time by forces that did not need anyone's conscious cooperation to function. It expressed itself in the 7th message's use of the word disposed, which was not chosen to wound her. It was chosen because it was, in the speaker's understanding of the situation, accurate. She texted him back, She said she had what she needed from the workshop. She said she hoped the property transferred smoothly. She said she would be in touch when she had something to be in touch about. She put the phone face down on the table and made coffee and sat in the kitchen and let the quiet of the apartment work on the edges of the moment until it was a reasonable shape to carry. There was nothing more to do about her brothers right now. The doing would come later, through processes already in motion, managed by people whose expertise was specifically calibrated to the kind of situation those processes were addressing. What she needed to do now was return to her work at the county health department and live in her apartment in the ordinary way and trust the people she had engaged to do what they were engaged to do. She was good at trusting the right people. She had gotten good at it the hard way, by trusting the wrong ones first and noticing the difference. The months that followed were among the quietest she had ever experienced, which was not an observation she had expected to make about a period during which so much was happening. The conservation facility sent progress reports through Dr. Okoye and Catherine, and she read them carefully and filed them and asked the specific questions that reading them carefully generated and received specific answers, and filed those as well. The legal process had its own rhythm, slower than anything that operated on the time scale of ordinary life, moving in increments that were meaningful but not visible from week to week, the way the growth of a tree is meaningful but not visible between one Tuesday and the next. She continued to work her records position at the county health department. She continued to eat dinner alone most evenings. She went to the library on Saturday mornings and read. She called her mother twice a month on Sundays, and her mother asked careful questions about the estate, and she answered them honestly, without saying more than she knew with certainty, because what she knew with certainty was still evolving, and she did not want to say things that would require later revision. Her mother, who had watched the attorney's conference room distribute what it distributed, who had heard the sound that was not quite a laugh and understood exactly what it communicated, asked only once, quietly, at the end of a call in the early weeks, "Are you all right?" She said yes. She said she was careful. She said she had good people around her. Her mother said she was glad. Then she said, in the specific tone of someone who has said most of what they intend to say and is adding the last part without embellishment, "He loved you. Your grandfather. He loved you in the particular way of a person who has no adequate language for it and so finds other means." She held the phone and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, I know he did." The first formal confirmation arrived in the 9th month. It came through Catherine, who called on a Thursday morning while she was at her desk at the county health department, reviewing documentation for a vaccination record audit, and asked whether she had a moment to speak. She said she did, and stepped into the corridor with her phone, and Catherine's voice on the other end was the same measured, precise instrument it always was, and what it told her had the quality of something that had been carefully prepared in advance so that its delivery would be equal to its content. 2 of the paintings had been formally attributed, not provisionally, not with qualifications, but with the completeness of institutional confirmation, backed by multispectral analysis, pigment composition studies, dendrochronological dating of the panel supports, and the concordance of the documentary record from the Footlocker with 2 separate archival sources in European institutions that had been cross-referencing the same collection for decades without possessing the link the documents provided. The family whose collection it had been was named in the attribution records. Their representatives had been contacted through the legal channels Catherine had established. They had received the news with the particular gravity of people who have waited for a long time for something important to stop being absent and have not been certain it ever would. Catherine said that the remaining pieces were in various stages of the same process and that conclusions were expected within a further 3 to 4 months. She asked about the large piece, the one Gerald had examined last, the one Dr. Okoye had recovered with both hands. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the attribution process for the large piece was the most complex because of what the piece appeared to be, and that complexity in this context was not a problem, but a reflection of significance. She said that the institutions involved had convened a dedicated committee, which was not standard procedure, and that the committee's deliberations were proceeding carefully. She said she would communicate immediately when there was a conclusion. She thanked Catherine and said goodbye, and stood in the corridor of the county health department for a moment, with her phone in her hand, looking at the institutional beige of the wall in front of her. Then she went back to her desk and returned to the vaccination record audit. She told no one. The second confirmation came 6 weeks later, also through Catherine, also on a weekday, this time in the evening when she was in her apartment. Catherine did not use any of the language of qualification that had attended earlier conversations. She was direct in the way that she was always direct, so in what she said arrived with the clarity of something that no longer required management of the person receiving it. The large piece had been attributed. The attribution was unanimous. The committee had issued its conclusion with the kind of language that academic and institutional bodies reserve for the cases that occur rarely enough to require it. The language that doesn't hedge because the evidence doesn't hedge. The piece was what Gerald had believed it might be. The piece was, in the judgment of the institutions that had examined it, significant in the way that Gerald had declined to describe with specific digits until the institutions had spoken. The piece was now described in the preliminary reports circulating among the relevant bodies as one of the most important privately preserved discoveries of the past half-century. The combined value of the collection, Catherine said, was being assessed through a process that the restitution framework governed, and that negotiation was beginning in earnest. The numbers on the table were consistent with what she had described earlier as the floor Gerald had identified. The ceiling, she said, was something that the negotiation would establish. She asked Catherine to send her the preliminary reports when they were cleared for her review. Catherine said she would send them in the morning. She put the phone down and sat in the apartment that had been her home for 4 years, with its industrial proportions and its provisional furniture, and looked at the room around her in the particular way of someone who is attempting to hold a large thing steadily, and is finding that large things do not ask to be held in the same way as small ones. They have a different weight and a different distribution and require a different kind of balance. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the footlocker in the corner of the workshop and the mechanism at the back left corner of the false panel, and the things that had waited inside the cavity through 6 decades of seasons and administrations and ordinary life on a gravel road in a county that did not appear in most national publications for any reason. She thought about what her grandfather had done with this. He had not donated it. He had not disclosed it. He had not enriched himself with it. He had maintained it, and as he maintained all things in his workshop that he believed deserved maintenance, he had kept it intact and documented and exactly as he had received it, minus nothing, changed in no way except for the protective materials he had added to ensure that what was inside the cavity remained in the condition required for it to eventually go where it needed to go. This was not nothing. She had understood that from the beginning, but she understood it more fully now, in the context of what the formal processes had confirmed. He had been, for 60 years, the custodian of something that belonged to people who had been looking for it. He had not exploited it. He had not destroyed it. He had kept it for the moment when keeping it would become returning it. He had needed someone to carry it forward. He had chosen her. The notification came to Catherine in the 5th month after the second formal attribution, and Catherine brought it to her in person rather than by phone, which told her something about the nature of what was coming before Catherine had said a word. They sat at the table in her grandfather's kitchen, which she had been visiting more frequently during the process, treating the house as a kind of base of operations for the ongoing legal and institutional work, feeling increasingly that the house was somewhere she would eventually need to make a decision about, rather than simply a setting for decisions made by others. Catherine had driven out herself, in the same practical manner she brought to everything, and she arrived with a leather portfolio and the expression of a professional who has navigated many complex situations and has arrived at one of the good ones. She said the negotiation was complete. She said the family, through their representatives, had agreed to a finder's and preservation fee in recognition of the care with which the collection had been maintained and the completeness of the documentation that had made its recovery possible. She said the fee was governed by the applicable international frameworks and was consistent with the precedents set in comparable restitution cases. She said the legal instruments were ready for signature. She said the amount was $319 million. She had known the number was coming. She had known it in the general sense for months. The way you know the weather is changing when the light shifts in a particular direction, without knowing the precise form the change will take until it arrives, but knowing in the general sense and receiving the specific number from Catherine's voice in her grandfather's kitchen, with the morning light falling across the table between them, were not the same experience. She sat with it for a long time. Catherine did not rush her. After a while, she asked, "Does this need to be announced?" Catherine said that the family's representatives had their own communications to manage, and that there would be an announcement through the institutional channels, a press release from the relevant bodies, a statement from the family, coverage in the publications that covered this kind of news. Her name would not be in those announcements. She was not required to be public. The terms of the agreement allowed her complete privacy, if that was what she preferred. She said that was what she preferred. Catherine said she understood. They signed the documents at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, and Catherine witnessed and notarized and said she would file everything the same day. And then she drank the second cup of coffee she had been offered and asked a few questions about the property and the house and what her plans were, which were questions asked in the tone of genuine curiosity rather than professional necessity, and she answered them in the same spirit. She said she thought she might stay for a while. Catherine said that sounded reasonable. She said the house was in good condition, and the property was larger than she had realized from the inside, and she said she had been thinking about the workshop. Catherine gathered her portfolio and her coat and said she would be in touch regarding the transfer timeline, and then she drove away down the gravel road, and the sound of the truck faded into the ordinary sounds of a morning in a place where the air was still and the tree line stood at the edge of the property as it always had. She sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after Catherine left. Before any of that, before the transfer and the announcement and the brothers and the everything that followed, there was one morning she had not anticipated and could not have planned for. It came about 6 weeks after Catherine's visit to the kitchen table with the portfolio. She had driven out to the property as she often did now, and she was in the workshop doing the slow, ungrounding work of organizing her grandfather's lumber by dimension and condition, the kind of task that does not demand thought but rewards presence, when she heard tires on the gravel. She did not move immediately. She listened to the car stop and the door open and the steps on the gravel, and then she heard the knock on the workshop door, which was propped open, and she turned. A woman stood in the doorway. She was perhaps 70 years old, slight and upright, her white hair cut short, her coat a precise charcoal gray that had the quality of clothing maintained through decades rather than recently purchased. She carried a small bag, and she stood in the doorway with the composure of a person who has made a considered decision to be somewhere and is not apologizing for it. She introduced herself in English that carried the formal cadence of someone for whom it was a second language and who had learned it well enough that the formality had become habitual. She said her name. She said she was a representative of the family. She said she had asked Catherine for permission to come, and that Catherine had indicated it was her decision, and that she had not told her it was coming because she wanted to leave the decision entirely to her without pressure. She asked the woman to come inside. They stood in the workshop for a moment, the woman's gaze moving across the walls and the tools and the workbench with the same kind of reading she had seen Gerald do on his first visit, the reading of a room for what it tells you. The woman's gaze stopped at the corner where the footlocker had been. She said, "It was there." And the woman said, "Yes, I thought it would be there." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was very full. The woman said that she was not there to thank her in the formal way. She said the formal thank you was in the statement and in the legal documents and in the various institutional communications. She said she had come because there was something she wanted to say that was not in any of those places. She said, "Please." The woman said that her grandmother had believed, until the day she died, that the paintings would come back. Not hoped. Believed. She said her grandmother had spoken about them not as lost things, but as displaced things, which she had always understood to be a meaningful distinction for a person of her grandmother's character. Lost things are gone. Displaced things are somewhere, held by circumstances that can change. She said her grandmother had died 20 years earlier without seeing the return, and that what had made the return possible was the same precision of care that her grandmother had recognized as the condition of displacement rather than loss. Someone had taken the works, not to destroy them, but to protect them, and had kept them in a condition that proved the original judgment to have been correct. The woman paused. She said, "She would have wanted to be here." She said, "I know. I'm sorry she isn't." The woman looked at her for a moment in the way of someone who is deciding whether to say the last thing they have come to say. Then she said it. She said, "Whoever kept them knew what they had, and whoever kept them gave them to the right person to return them." That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. She had no language for what she felt in that moment that was adequate to the feeling. So she did what her grandfather had always done in the presence of things too large for language. She said nothing, and she let the room hold it. And the room, which was good at holding things, did what it had always done. The woman stayed for another hour. They walked through the workshop, and the woman asked about the tools, and she explained what each was for, which she could do now with a competence acquired over months of working in the space. The woman was interested in a way that was genuine rather than polite. When she left, she shook her hand and held it for a moment, and then walked back to her car on the gravel and drove away. And the gravel road returned to silence, and the morning light fell across the workshop floor the way it always fell, at the particular angle of that hour, moving across the worn surface of the workbench like something that had been doing this for a long time and intended to continue. The brothers found out through the institutional announcement, which ran in 3 publications over a 2-day period in the week after the agreements were signed. She did not know exactly how they connected the announcement to her, because her name was not in it, but she knew her older brother well enough to understand that he would look for the thread until he found it. And the thread, when followed, led back to a workshop at the end of a gravel road and a footlocker that he had described, in a voicemail she had not deleted, as something to be disposed of when the property transferred. The older brother called twice. She did not pick up. He sent a text that she read once, in full, and then archived without responding to. The text covered several familiar registers in succession: inquiry, then the suggestion of shared interest, then the implication that she had withheld information that affected the family, then a legal-sounding phrase about full disclosure obligations that reflected a layperson's understanding of an area of law he had no actual expertise in, then finally, at the end, a sentence that was simply his name and a question mark, as if the question mark might accomplish what the preceding sentences had not. She showed the text to Catherine, not because it required a response, but because she thought Catherine should know it existed. Catherine read it and said he had no legal standing that she could identify. She said if he retained counsel, and that counsel contacted her, she would deal with it directly. She said it was unlikely to go anywhere, and that she should not allow it to occupy more of her attention than it warranted. She said, "Understood." The younger brother did not contact her. She had not expected him to. There was a moment, about 3 weeks after the institutional announcement, when she was in the workshop working on a piece of furniture she had begun restoring. A small cabinet she had found stored in the back of the house, its finish worn and its joints loosened by decades of atmospheric change. And she became aware, in the way of someone who has been absorbed in a task, and surfaces suddenly into the broader context of their life, and of what the room around her now meant. The pegboard walls with their outlined tool shapes, the stacked lumber on the low brackets, the workbench with its worn surface and its accumulated record of work done carefully but not gently. The corner where the footlocker had been, empty now, the floor clean and unremarkable. She set the piece of furniture down and looked at the corner for a while. What she felt was not triumph. She had anticipated something that felt like triumph, in the way that a person who has been dismissed for a long time and then vindicated anticipates a specific emotional temperature for the moment of vindication. But what was actually present in the room was quieter than that. It was the particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from being proved right, but from having done a thing correctly. The difference between those two feelings, which can look similar from the outside, is substantial on the inside. She had not done anything remarkable. She had paid attention. She had been patient. She had trusted the right people and engaged the right processes. She had respected the thing she had been entrusted with, which was the primary obligation, and everything that followed from it had followed because she had met that obligation without compromise or shortcut. Her grandfather had done the same for 60 years, without recognition, without announcement, without the machinery of institutional acknowledgement. He had simply done the thing correctly, in the specific way of a person who understands that doing things correctly is its own sufficient purpose. And he had left it to the person he believed would carry that understanding forward. She picked up the cabinet and returned to work. The financial transfer completed on a Thursday afternoon, processed through the accounts Catherine had established as part of the legal structure, and she was notified by a message from Catherine's office that was 4 sentences long and ended with congratulations, which was the most expressive communication she had received from Catherine's office in the entire duration of the process, and which she appreciated precisely because of its rarity. She did not go out to celebrate. She did not call anyone. She made dinner from what was in her grandfather's refrigerator, which she had been stocking again during the period of her increasingly frequent visits. And she ate at the kitchen table with the window open to the evening, and she listened to the sounds of the property settling into the dark. The things she did in the weeks and months after that Thursday were done without hurry and without drama. She arranged for the payment of her mother's remaining mortgage, which was done through an attorney and without announcement, and her mother called her the week after the documents arrived to say that she had received something that she did not understand, and she said she would explain in person when she next visited, and her mother said, "It was him, wasn't it?" And she said, "Yes, in a way." She left her position at the county health department with proper notice and without antagonism toward the work, which had served its purpose during a period when purpose-serving was what she required of her working life. She was thanked at a small gathering and given a card signed by the people she had worked alongside, and she meant the gratitude she expressed in return. She moved into her grandfather's house, not as a project, not as a renovation, not as an act of preservation. She moved in as a person who has found the place that suits them and sees no reason to look further. She brought her minimal furniture, which fit the house's proportions better than it had fit the industrial apartment. And she brought her books. And she brought the stiff-covered notebook that contained her record of everything she had observed from the moment she first pressed her fingertip along the horizontal seam near the base of the footlocker and understood that the hollow space was the point. She kept the notebook in the workshop on the workbench, which she had cleared and cleaned and made her own working surface, while preserving the essential character of the room. The tools remained on the pegboard walls, outlined in pencil. The lumber remained stacked on the brackets. The smell remained what it had always been, and she understood now that the smell was not nostalgia or sentiment, but simple fact. The accumulated record of 60 years of work, done carefully in a space that had been organized by a person who thought spatially and never needed to search twice for anything. And she began a project of her own. She had been thinking about it since the early days of sitting in the workshop, watching Catherine and Gerald and Dr. Okoye work, since the days when she had crouched beside the footlocker with the flashlight and the nitrile gloves and understood for the first time how much attention the right object required. She had been thinking about documentation, about records, about the institutional gap that had allowed a collection of this significance to sit in a workshop for 6 decades without being connected to the people looking for it. She engaged Catherine to establish a small foundation. Not large, not ambitious in the way of things that want to be seen, but functional in the way of things that intend to do a specific job well. The foundation's purpose was to support the work of independent provenance researchers, the particular kind of archival detective work that had unlocked the footlocker's history, in cases where institutional resources did not reach. Catherine said it was a reasonable use of the capital and drafted the documents. She hired a single staff member, a young archivist, with a background in wartime cultural property records, and they worked together in a way that the young archivist later described in a profile in a small professional publication as the most methodical environment she had ever encountered, which she said in the tone of a person who considered methodical to be among the highest compliments. She did not become a public person. She did not give interviews. She did not appear in the coverage that continued sporadically as the institutional announcements elaborated the story of the collection and its recovery. She was referred to in that coverage, when she was referred to at all, as the custodian's descendant, which was accurate in the way that descriptions assigned by people who do not have all the information can sometimes be accidentally accurate. The family whose collection it had been issued a public statement several months after the return was completed and the institutional processes had been formally concluded. The statement was long and formal and covered the history of the collection and the history of the search and the significance of the recovery. Near its end, in language that had been negotiated through Catherine with the same care that had characterized every step of the process, it acknowledged the preservation. It said that the collection had been maintained with extraordinary care and diligence by a private individual over a period of 6 decades. It said that without that care, the documentation that enabled recovery would not have survived. It said the family expressed their profound and lasting gratitude. She read the statement once in full and then filed it. What she thought about most in the period after the conclusion was not the number or the statement or the foundation or the work she was doing in the workshop on the projects she had begun taking on. What she thought about most was a small thing, which was the way a mechanism sounds when it has been well made and well maintained and pressed correctly. Not a dramatic sound, a small one, a click that is barely louder than a breath. She had pressed the back left corner of the false panel and heard that sound and understood in the same moment that the hollow space was the point. The rest of it, the months of careful process, the institutional confirmation, the negotiated number, the foundation, the work going forward. All of it had flowed from that moment in the way that consequences flow from the decision to look carefully at a thing rather than looking past it. She thought about the word her grandfather had used in every room of that summer when she was 8, without ever saying it. But he had used it in the way that competent people always use the most important things, not by naming them, but by demonstrating them until the person watching has no choice but to understand. The word was attention. Pay attention. Not in the way of anxiety, not in the way of suspicion, but in the way of a person who understands that most things worth knowing are available to the person willing to look. The hollow and the solid speak different languages, and the languages can be learned. The grain of the wood tells you which direction to work. The seam near the base tells you what the exterior is concealing. The click of a mechanism tells you the door is open. She had been paying attention in that workshop on a morning in the early spring, with the flat gray light coming through the small windows and her grandfather's tools outlined on the pegboard walls, and what she had paid attention to had responded in the way that things always respond, to genuine attention. It had revealed itself. She thought about her grandfather standing at the end of that summer, with his hand on her shoulder, saying nothing. She understood it now, in its full dimension, which she had understood partially before, and could only understand fully from this side of what had happened. He had been saying goodbye in the manner of a person who does not do goodbyes dramatically. He had also been saying, "I see you. I know what you are. I know what you will be capable of when it matters." He had been right, which was not a thing she needed to say to anyone. It was sufficient to know it in the way she knew it now. In the workshop, and in the house, and in the particular quality of light on a morning when the work was going well, and the tools were where they were supposed to be, and the smell of the room was exactly what it had always been, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was here. She had not become a different person because of what was in the footlocker. She had become more fully the person she had been already, the person her grandfather had recognized and prepared for and trusted with the one thing he had kept through 60 years of ordinary life at the end of a gravel road in a county that did not appear in most national publications for any reason. The footlocker was gone now, transported carefully to the conservation facility, and from there to the family, who had asked to receive it along with the collection, not for the objects inside the main compartment, but for the history they represented and the care with which they had been kept. She had consented without hesitation. The footlocker belonged with what it had carried. What she had kept was what she had always had. The brass key, the notebook, the memory of a summer that had taught her something in the specific and lasting way of things, learned through doing rather than being told. And the house at the end of the gravel road, which was hers now, and which was quiet in the way it had always been quiet, and which asked nothing of her except the same thing it had asked of her grandfather, which was the same thing all the things that matter ultimately ask of the people who come into their keeping. Pay attention and do the work, and trust that the hollow space will tell you what it needs to tell you if you are willing to listen. She was. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.